Now the main event. On your behalf, I am delighted to welcome today's special guests. Judging by the sold-out nature of today's breakfast, I know you are very interested in what he has to say. His name and the firm he leads have as high a profile as any in the global economy and today's financial markets. Lloyd Blankfein is the Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of the Goldman Sachs Group. It's a leading global investment banking, securities, and investment management firm and a critical player in the North American and the global economy. Mr. Blankfein has held a variety of senior roles at Goldman Sachs for the past 30 years. His journey began in 1982 when he joined the J. Aron Currency and Commodities Division of the firm after practicing law. He was named partner in 1988 and became the co-head of his division in 1994. Prior to being appointed chairman and CEO, he served as the firm's president and chief operating officer from 2003 to 2006. Harvard-educated, Mr. Blankfein is active in a number of nonprofit organizations. Among them, he's a member of the Dean's Advisory Board at the Harvard Law School, a member of the Dean's Council at Harvard University, clearly a loyal alum, and a board member of the Partnerships of New York City. He is joined in conversation this morning by one of Canada's most distinguished business executives, Gordon Nixon, the President and CEO of RBC, one of Canada's leading financial institutions. Gentlemen, thank you both very much for joining us, and the podium is yours.
Thank you very much.
Gordon? Morning, Lloyd.
Good morning.
This is a new job for me, maybe a second career. I feel very powerful.
You are very powerful, that's
well,
why.
I feel much more powerful as a journalist than I do as an asker of questions. Delighted to have you here in Canada, and I know the audience is very much looking forward to your perspective on what's going on around the world and what's going on in the financial services industry, which is certainly facing some challenges. Thought we'd start with your views on the global economy, and perhaps you could start in Europe and sort of make your way around the world, and perspective on what you see in terms of growth, and perhaps more importantly, what are the challenges out there that we're all going to have to deal with over the next period of time.
Well, there's not enough time for all the challenges, but let me just give you some perspective. Listen, let me get to let me give away the punchline. The punchline is, I think, on a world basis, this is, the world's not going to come to an end. We're going to muddle through, but there are a lot of challenges and a lot of risks. And I think the largest outcome, the largest percentage likely outcome by far is that we get through. And I think there's a lot of actions that have been taken that offer some relief, but there's several things that could cause things to derail, in which case things will be a lot tougher for a lot longer. But you asked about Europe, and I think the biggest problem that Europe has is growth, and the tail risk problem is a real go off the rail bust up of the euro. The way a few months ago we would have said that the two big issues for Europe is, do they have the capacity to bring the periphery along and to buy enough time and give enough support so they can cure their ills. And then the second one, do they have the political will? With the latter question probably being the most important question. You hear all the pundits in the world and says, the German electorate will never support this and never support that, and it's going to go blow up. I would say if we saw anything in the last few months, it confirms that they have the capacity, because you can see they've gone all in to an extent, and I believe that they have the capacity to do it. But what is a surprise to many, but hasn't been a surprise to me for a long time, because I go and I talk to some of the leaders there, is the political will to make Europe work and the euro work. You have to remember that it was a political construct, not just an economic construct, and they wear the history very close to the surface. And the importance of Europe, if this fails, it'll be 100 years before you can go back and think of the united Europe, and the consequences of a disunited Europe feel very, very heavy to the leadership. And so you could see Mrs. Merkel, certainly the ECB wouldn't have been able to provide the virtually unlimited liquidity they were able to without the acquiescence of the leadership of Germany, and in a lot of these places around Europe, the pro-European party and the election Senate has won, and the opposition is even more European-oriented. So I feel that it's going to be a muddle through. The real issue, of course, is growth, and the real issue is how do they solve the long-term problems, and those things are antagonistic to each other, because to solve the problems means austerity. Austerity means deflation and not growth, and that's the real challenge. How do they sponsor growth in the short term and promise the market austerity and more balanced budgets in the long term? And that's the challenge ahead, but I think they have enough time and the political will to get this done. But there are challenges, and there's a chance of going off the rail there. But I think it's unlikely at this point, much less likely than it would have been a few months ago.
So you think your old partner, Mario Draghi's done the right thing with the bond purchase program? A lot of people would say he's just kicked the problem further down the road, but...
Well, I would say that the first thing you have to do in any kind of triage situation is you have to stabilize the patient, and maybe that's a different metaphor from kicking the can down the road, but I think they definitely needed to buy time. They will merely have bought time if they don't engineer structural changes to the economies, and then we will look back and say, my God, we only bought time, we poured more money after bad money, and I wish we had faced up to the problem earlier. If they, on the other hand, use the time to engineer the structural changes, which I think everybody knows needs to be done, the question is there enough courage in the political system to drive those changes to an electorate in the periphery that won't really love them? Then we'll say, we didn't kick the can down the road, we bought ourselves the necessary time to achieve the result that we will have achieved. And so I'll let you know how it works out, and then in hindsight, I'll second guess.
So moving to Asia and China in particular, emerging markets generally, but China in particular, and then we'll come back to the U.S.
Sure.
But obviously China is facing a bit of a slowdown. You've got significant operations over there. What's your view in terms of short-term, long-term prospects for?
Well, I'd say that in terms of things that could go wrong, the China hard landing versus soft landing issue is, I would say, not the most extreme thing that could go wrong, but maybe the highest possibility of something that could go wrong with, maybe not the most draconian consequences, but something that would really derail everybody's ambitions for an accelerating growth at something, because a lot of the marginal demand in the world over the last couple of years has come from China, and the hopes of China stabilizing and then rebounding is very important. And I think the jury is still out. Don't forget, China is going through in China, the downturn was engineered to some extent, but it was not engineered randomly. It was engineered because things in their structure, was making demand overheated. You saw the real estate bubble in China. When you're making a lot of money and you're benefiting from a low currency, and you're accumulating wealth in the country, and you have a managed currency with exchange controls. There's only a few things you could buy, and those things you could buy have a lot of competition to buy them. And you saw real estate prices dramatically in a very much overheated situation, and I think they put on the brakes. Also, every country which would grow at that faster rate needs a period of time when you slow up and you say, when are we going to write off our mistakes? Because undoubtedly, if we've grown so much of over 10% for so long, and then when you had the financial crisis, go out and make a tremendous stimulus program through increased bank lending, how much of those loans are not going to be repaid back? How many of those airports that were all built at the same time will be in the wrong place? How many of those roads will go nowhere? Just in any place, that would be the case. We have a better mechanism in our economies for writing off mistakes. They write themselves off, much to our chagrin at times. But there, you need to slow up, and I think they did a good job of engineering that slow up. But like a plane that goes into a stall, you worry, is it gonna, you're gonna start those engines before we hit the ground? And I think that's one of the risks for the world, and it happens to be contemporaneous with a change in political leadership that hasn't gone as smoothly, and not that it's going smoothly any place in the world, but it's not going smoothly there, and so I think that there's a risk there. Now, if you ask me how it works out, I think they've done an amazing job to this point, And I generally have a lot of confidence, and it goes back to the core values of the country and the quality of the people, and frankly, it's only in China where you would regard a 7 and change % growth rate as a prompt for hand wringing, and I really do have confidence. But if this is the century of China, the way some people thought that the 20th century was the century of America, it wasn't, you had the Panic of '07 and the Great Depression and all these different movements. It's not going to be smooth. And when it goes bad, when we go through one of those moments in China, it won't feel as one of the bad years of the century. People will think, oh my God, what was I thinking to begin with? This is bad, and then it'll get better, and they'll thinking, what was I thinking when I changed my mind? Of course, this is wealth being created here, big population, very commercial. So I think it all works out. For a firm like ourselves, we have to make sure we scale our activities and stay engaged and keep ourselves active and engaged during the slower periods so that we preserve our opportunities during the busier periods. But net, I'm very confident in the outcome, but you have to recognize it as one of the risks of the world that instead of providing a lot of extra demand, China disappoints. But it won't be for a long time if it does.
In the U.S. now, we've had 5 years, peak to trough, of virtually zero growth, high rates of unemployment, fiscal imbalance, which is quite remarkable and structurally unsustainable, with very little political will to deal with it. I think here in Canada, we look at the U.S. with amazement because we went through.
Who are these people?
Well, we went through this in the early 90s and took some political action to put our fiscal house in order. Obviously, that's a bigger challenge in the United States, and we're adding $1 trillion of debt year after year. How does it unplay?
I'm glad we could serve as a source of entertainment to the Canadian community.
Well, so how do you think the U.S. does play out?
I think that's a big risk also. The frustrating thing in the U.S. is that the core is so strong and so good. We have, think of the immigration. And by the way, you could average out and say almost no growth over 5 years, which includes the downturn. But basically, that 2% was very hard fought for, so let's not ignore that. And it's a big economy, and 2% on a big economy is a big number, and I think it goes. But it's very, these problems are self-afflicted to a great extent, and it makes it all the more frustrating, and it must be frustrating to watch when you saw the saga of last summer with the debt ceiling and saying, why don't you vote for this, or why don't you compromise, or why don't you get this done? I would say it's sometimes more frustrating to watch something that you can, it's like watching it's like being a voyeur and watching something where you see it spiraling and you just wish you could stop it, and it's within everybody's power to stop it. And I think it's a defect of the political system to some extent. But historically in the U.S., it's never crashed and burned, and people do assert themselves, and people do eventually have that profiles and courage moment where they step out and they make those changes, and it won't look like that before it happens, but generally it happens, and I think people have to, the way that America has historically been structured, it's a two-party system, it's not a parliamentary system. What you were supposed to do is you were supposed to have, frankly, the moderates of each party getting together and forming a majority that's recognizing that each party will, the left will have its radical left and the right will have its radical right, but the country was designed to steer a course because the group that was supposed to put together was not to have one party you weren't supposed to have the moderates in one party accede to its extreme. You were supposed to have the moderates in each get together and fashion a plan. So things were supposed to change, but not that much all at once.
That's assuming there are moderates.
Yeah, well, there are always moderates, but if moderation is a pejorative, you're not going to have a lot and a guarantee of your failure at the polls, which it seems to be in some cases. That's not going to be that's not a good environment for compromise. So things have always worked themselves through, and I think they will now. But that fiscal cliff thing is looming as a real problem, and it doesn't have to be, because the basic guts of it are good, and I think relying on the central bank to shoulder all the burden of charging the economy and abandoning fiscal, the fiscal side because of the difficulty in the political process is unfair. It gives us a skewed, an unfair view of the real, I think, in a lot of ways, courage, whether it works or not, is still open and people debate it, but certainly people are exercising their powers that they've been granted fully. But, if you're only working, if only one side of the car is driving, you're going to go in circles.
So we get Simpson Bowles, we just get it 2 years too late with a couple $1 trillion of extra debt on top.
It is, but sometimes the politics need that time to sort out because you have to bring everyone with it. The fact that it's inefficient in the long term is the efficiencies that we take in order to get people to throw in the long term are worth it and is really what makes the system stable. So I'm not worried that where we get it. And let me just say, on the more optimistic side, people have really thrown, you don't get a debate in the United States of whether the US has a fiscal deficit problem or whether it has to be solved. That, a year ago, that would have been debated. Now the debate is how we're going to solve it. Are we going to solve it on the revenue side? Are we going to solve it on the expenditure side? But there's no one who's saying we really should widen the deficit or the deficit as wide as it is not a problem. Everyone accedes to it. But the real debate is about how to get it done and also the nature of the government that's the consequence of how it gets done. Obviously, if you spend more, government's going to grow. If you shrink the budget, government will contract, and that has implications for the republic that have been, by the way, debated since Jefferson and Hamilton. It's an ongoing debate always in America. But if you think about what's been accomplished in the last year, everyone knows we have to solve the problem. How to solve it has resulted in an impasse. But the fact that everybody agrees it needs to be solved is really the most important thing.
But it seems to me that it's a math problem. And as you said, if you've got, slow but stable growth for an extended period of time here, then ultimately revenues have to go up and expenditures have to go down. Neither of which is particularly healthy in terms of fostering economic growth. If you have taxes going up in the United States and you have expenditures going down, ultimately that has to happen if you're going to solve that math problem in a slow growth world.
It's the same in Europe and the same everywhere. We all grew up reading Keynes, and it says spend more money. So we only have to do two things. We have to spend more money to charge up the economy, and we have to spend less money in order to shrink the deficits. All it goes to show, whether you're a country or a company, is when you get in trouble, your options are reduced. And so this is not easy because the options have been reduced. You can't go out and, we already had it. You can't go out and have another stimulus and look at the consequences to the balance sheet as a result of what that'll be. What you're going to have to do, I think, is you're going to have to not shrink not push austerity in the near term, because that will be, that's the fiscal cliff, and you're going to have to keep going on certain things and keep not the stimulus, but not take away the punch bowl in the near term. But you're going to have to convince the market and the lenders and galvanize the country that in the longer term you're going to get those things done. So this goes back to your point about kicking it down the road. You're going to have to show the resolve to solve this problem over the longer term, but in the short term, it's not going to be very good if the medicine you give kills the patient. And so that, going back to the way you framed the first question, which is right, what do you think about Europe and what do you think about growth? You need growth also, and you can't austere yourself into a higher GDP. So I think the issue is going to be, I'm all for implementing budget changes that accelerate over the long term, but in the short term, I wouldn't take too much money away from people or cut back on a lot of expenditure programs.
Moving on to the social implications of what has occurred over the last 5 years. The way I describe it to my kids is that our generation, you and I are the same generation, had an incredibly lengthy party. We're now suffering from a hangover. We're turning to our kids.
Sorry, this is how you talk to your kids?
We're now turning to our kids and we're saying it's your job to clean up and
I'll do the same thing. I'll say,
pay the bill.
Gord is suffering from a hangover.
Right. So you look at the next generation, you have very high youth unemployment. In Europe, the numbers are staggering. Even in the United States, particularly if you look at the real youth unemployment numbers, they're well into the high double digits. And you've got the Occupy movement, you've got a lot of social unrest, the inequality issue. Obviously, Goldman has been, to some degree, at the center of that discussion and debate. You know, what is your take on the social implications of what has happened in the financial services industry and the global economy, and how that plays out, and what the impact of that might be in terms of political flexibility going forward?
No, I think the last question is really the punchline, draws out the punchline. I said, look, let me say it's not just been the last 5 years. To some extent, we're stewards of the economy. To some, not really. We're marketeers, we play our role in it, but, in good times, we walk around like, to some extent, this is a bad analogy, but the people, if you're going to be the samurai class, if you lose a war, you got to be prepared to take the consequences of it. If you're going to get the benefits when things are good, because you carry yourself in a certain kind of way, you're going to have to, and it's not unfair for people to ask you to bear the brunt of the failure of the system that you were a big part of. It's not just 5 years. If you look at the widening of inequality in the United States, it's been a march of over, been a march for 30 years. And so people, and to some extent, I don't think there's a lot of social unrest in the United States. Maybe people worry that there'll be more, and I don't want to dare anything because I think it's appropriate to be nervous. But don't forget, the United States has a political system, and you can vote, and you have access, and people's voices are heard, and you get these tectonic, you get these shifts, and so that appropriately takes the starch out of it, because people can express themselves at the ballot box, and they do. But you don't need to have social unrest per se to recognize that one of the two goals of the financial system and the economic system, not just the financial system, but the whole economic and the production system, should be to expand the wealth of the world and to distribute it fairly. And the two are linked, but they're totally separate, because if you were the richest country in the world and wealth was disproportionate, you wouldn't have a stable society. And if you had and I could tell you have a lot of stable societies that are just stable and deadly poor. And so you need to achieve both. And I think in the United States, over the last generation or two, we've been much better at generating wealth and much less good at distributing it in a way. And I'm not saying, no one's going to accuse me of being a socialist, and I'm not. And I don't believe in wealth distribution, redistribution over producing. And if you believe in production, then you have to believe in incentives and the consequence of giving people incentives. They have to bear the benefits and the fruits of it. But over the long term, if the system works well, it should accomplish both goals. And it hasn't accomplished enough of the second goal in the right way. And that's what the distress is over. And, it's different things, if you're on the front of people's minds, and different people will get disproportionate. I'm not saying the attention that the financial industry gets, or our institutions per se, or us per se, is unfair. It's of course disproportionate, relative, and it's just it's the nature of things, and that happened after the Depression with the kind of household word big financial institutions. And I think it's certainly, if you're me, it's distracting to say the least. But I don't want to suggest that we're repelling the notion of it because it's unfair. It's just disproportionate. It's fair to the extent that we are fiduciaries in some part for the financial system, and it hasn't worked well enough for everybody. And so we have to go out and have a good conversation, dialogue, recommending changes to it, and get engaged. Now, the trauma in the U.S. was so recent and so powerful that we're not having necessarily a good conversation or dialogue. People get called in, other people are held at arm's length. People count the number of times you visit the White House, or you go into this building as if the people who manage and regulate the economy are somehow doing something wrong if they talk to the private sector leaders of the economy. I mean, it's a certain amount of craziness has to dissipate, and then we have to engage in a very, very serious conversation about something that affects all our well-being.
CEO of Goldman, a socialist, that would be actually a pretty good headline.
I've seen every other headline.
That's true. Our industry, and particularly in Europe and the United States, it's a little bit better here in Canada, but has obviously lost a tremendous amount of trust. how does that trust get recaptured? Is that starting to happen? What does the industry have to do to restore? I mean, this is an industry that is built on trust, yet it's probably the least trusted industry of virtually any today. How do we shift that, and how does that change?
I think you have to, I think it would be a good start would be not to have any more stories surface that further erode trust. That would be a good start would be to stop having problems. And I don't know that we've run out of problems yet. And I think what happens, when you have a crisis like this and you investigate, there's things that would have looked bad at any time that you suddenly discover that you didn't discover before. And there are things that wouldn't have even looked bad in the prior times that look bad today in the context of what we now know, with after acquired information about how things turned out. And I think we have to work our way through our problems, and obviously the anger has to dissipate and and the response to it and the reticence that some leaders in the industry, including myself, have had about getting out and engaging in a positive way. That has to recede, and then go out and run your business as well, accomplish your social purpose about managing risk and helping to finance good ideas and making good selections on what gets financed and what doesn't, and perform the role that you have in the system, but also get out and engage and show your bona fides as people who are working for taking positive steps, even if some of those steps would appear controversial and not politically correct at the moment. And that has to be done. Now, I will say, as somebody there, if it's so difficult and painful to lift your head above the parapet, then you have, that it's not going to be effective even if you took the risk and did it. So, and this is all normal, unfortunately. And I think the pendulum, I think time has to go. Some of the pain has to recede, and we have to roll up our sleeves and get to work. And if people see us working and engaging and doing the right thing, and sharing our views, and it's right and makes sense, and we communicate more, that would represent a step in the right direction. And if we do that about 200 years, people will start to trust us.
So financial regulation, I'm of the view that financial regulation and its complexity is having a much more significant negative impact on economic growth globally than most regulators or central bankers will admit to. Obviously, that's debated. But it's had a huge impact, and it's had a huge impact particularly in the capital markets side of the business, which is virtually 100% of your business. What is your perspective on regulation? I mean, is it having a big drag on economic growth? Is it too complex, as fortunately one of the central bankers said in Jackson Hole, or one of the senior executives of the Bank of England? It's obviously very politicized, the whole industry. I mean, what sort of drag is regulation and politicization of the industry having in terms of our ability to move forward?
Well, look, you can't have gone through what everybody has gone through. And I mean, and forget about us, forget about the people in the street, the people who had you can argue from today who's more responsible, was this, but certainly the great mass of people had no responsibility at all and bore the consequences of it. You can't go through that and then say we're not going to go out and do something different, so that it's less likely to happen again. Forget about whether you'll never have another 100-year storm. Of course, every 100 years you'll have a 100-year storm, and some things will happen again. But you have to go out and you have to take steps. You have to have different regulation, maybe more regulation in certain respects. And so we're not going to ever be in the situation. I think it sounds absurd to say, to just talk about the burdens of regulation without talking about what's driving people to want to regulate. And so you have to, first thing you do, you have to meet that, injunction. It's essential. Can you imagine if I weren't in this industry and observing the industry, and I was listening to somebody say, oh my God, this is going to kill, this is going to really hurt you if you put more constraints on me, having just gone through what I've gone through. Of course, you have to be realistic about this. We need that. What I think we need to do, what I think is not our privilege, but our responsibility as practitioners in the market, is that we have to, as best as we can, spell out the consequences of regulation and different things and the trade-offs, and the political system will appropriately make those judgments. And by the way, they may make those judgments and then revise those judgments. The pendulum will go and they'll recede. Right now, if you polled everybody, everybody would, if there's a trade-off between regulation, or let's say risk, and growth, people would say, I'll abandon growth, just don't be so risky. But if there's in a couple of years, if there's less lending, in other words, a consequence of so much more capital means less leverage means less loans per dollar of capital. And if you live with the consequences of a world that's less leveraged, in a couple of years when it's receded, you might say, something? I'd like to revise that position where we are. I think our job is to explain to people what the consequence of this is. To people, make them understand, and then accept the fact that the pendulum may swing a little far because of just the recency of the trauma. Look, we never had more than 2 hurricanes. We never had more than in the eastern end of Long Island, in Long Island where I live, and except for the summer, we had 4. If you priced hurricane insurance off of 4 hurricanes, nobody ever built a house again there. And we never had it before. So insurance premiums quadrupled the next year, and over the next 5 years, it went down. And actually, the year after those 4 hurricanes, there was no more risk of 4 hurricanes than there was the year before it. But sentiment and riskiness and trauma and how painful things are have a real effect on people's calculus of the risk they want to take going forward. And over time, it gets to a sensible level. And so I think regulation is best done if you had the Depression in 1929, and the first legislation that was passed was the Securities and Exchange Act of 33, followed by the Securities and Exchange Act of 34, 35, 37, 39, 40, 40, and it kept getting modified along the way as you felt around for it. I think that will happen now, and doing it. Now, I can address separate pieces. I think, Basel and additional capital, I think that's the most important thing. Banks should have more capital and more liquidity. Now, devil's in the detail. If you attach certain kinds of capital requirements onto kind of securitized products, because that was what seemed to blow up mostly before, and you make it excessive, then banks won't hold inventories of securitized products. And where's the mortgage market going to go in the United States? And you'll say, that's a good thing. Who needs a mortgage market? Look how it got us into trouble. But 4 years from now, if the only housing that's getting financed is by government administrations, we won't like that. And so those are the kinds of things. So where do you want to be on the spectrum? Well, we can't go to an extreme because we don't want to live with the extreme. We don't want to impoverish ourselves by saying you have to run yourself with no risk. So that's how you get to do it. I don't want to diminish the exercise by saying it, but if you have to run yourself so you won't get hurt by the 50-year storm, the problem that occurs once every 50 years, the other 49 years in between are not going to be that fun. But if you run yourself so that you could get, and so that's how you have to think about it. But we have to have these conversations not as a 30,000 foot. We have to get right down. This is the predictable consequence of attaching this risk weighting to this kind of asset. And there has to be, and by the way, there is, certainly I could speak for the US, there's a lot of engagement between the writers of the regulation and the practitioners of the market, as there should be.
And the politicians, they get in the way, or do they?
Well, everybody has, it's bifurcated, because even the politicians that seem to be saying provocative things have staffs that are trying to get it right, and they're trying to get it right. Politicians have a number of jobs, including staying close. Look, you have to lead the electorate, but you have to be reelected by the electorate. So if you lead too far, you don't really draw people with you. So there's, I don't think it's such an easy life trying to be a politician either, with the pressures that they're under and the demands, on them. And, at the same time, I haven't liked everything that was done, nor have they liked everything that we did. Right. But if we switch jobs, neither one of us would find the other job so appealing either.
So let's move to, because I think we're almost out of time here, let's move to Goldman specifically. Obviously, you have some strategic challenges as a result of regulation and the changing of the markets. When you look at the return on equity across the capital markets business, it's come down